and welcome to Quality of Life Radio, hosted by Lisa and Nancy, editors of BigBlendMagazine.com.
Today on Big Blend Radio, we are talking with Vivian-Conan. She is a librarian. I love that. We always love to chat with librarians. She's a writer, and also she knows about IT stuff that we won't get into that as much probably today. But she is joining us on Big Blend Radio today to talk about her book. It's called Losing-the-Atmosphere-Memoir, A Baffling Disorder, A Search for Help, and the Therapist Who Understood. You can imagine what it is like suddenly having different personalities and talking to them in the mirror, just like, hello, this is who I am, or having a conversation. But she really went through a lot of therapy, a lot of hospitalizations, and finally got a diagnosis. It is called Dissociative-Identity-Disorder. Many of you may have known it as Mulitple-Personalities-Disorder. So we're very excited to have her on the show, and I want to tell you her book is out now. You can also get it as an audio book. And you go to her website, Vivian-Conan.com. So, Vivian, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Hey, we really, really appreciate you writing. I know you've done, you've had a column in the New York Times on their blog. You've written in a lot of magazines and websites about this. And I didn't even know it was called Dissociative Identity Disorder. You never really, I don't think we've never interviewed anyone about this. I don't think we hear very much about it. I think the only thing I've ever known about it is the movie Sybil, which actually is a true story. I remember reading the book when I was a young girl, and so I had no idea. So I'm probably like a lot of other people. You rarely get to hear about this, so we really appreciate it. And your memoir is so well written as well. You're definitely an awesome writer. So thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it.
I thank you for having me, and I just wanted to say something to what you just said. It's not as rare as people think, but people think it's rare because they don't think that anybody they know could have this. But it turns out it's more common than people think.
I think that having read part of your book, it sounds exactly like how I grew up, and I think because there was that era of everything's hush-hush and you don't ever talk about any kind of medical, especially mental disorders or illnesses or whatever you want to, call it, personality disorder. I've heard that. People just didn't talk about it, so nothing got done about it. And this, I'm reading that this father, you can just swap him out for mine. Even down to the music lessons, it was like this personality that invaded everything you ever thought you were interested could do had to be controlled. And I'm glad you are writing this because I think people who grow up under that kind of parent always feel totally alone. They really do, because people don't want to interfere with the family. School counselors usually make they don't know how to take over, and they might know now, but when I was growing up, the worst thing that could happen was a school counselor talks to your parents. That was like, oh boy.
And if your parents happen to be the problem, that's even a worse thing that your school counselor did.
Yeah, it got really bad, interfered, really bad.
Well, let's backtrack a little bit because it is talk about this disorder. I don't even like to use those words, but it seems to me from reading that it is a way to. It's like it's because it does. I understand they call it disorder, but it's in a way to me it seems like it was a coping mechanism in a way. It was almost like you had this set of tools to kind of handle what was going on growing up, and it obviously bled into your adulthood, but was traumatic for you. So but at the same time, it seemed like if you didn't have it, it could have been worse, right?
Exactly, and I don't like the word disorder either. I like the word adaptation.
Okay, can I just say something? When I was saying disorder, I was not talking about you. I was talking about the father.
That's what they call it.
Okay, that's fine, but I would
not talking about the father sorry, I didn't make that clear. The father is, I know that's where I'm talking about disorder.
Yeah.
To make that clear,
But
because
they do call
obviously
it
the man was ill.
They call it Dissociative-Identity-Disorder, and it was once known as Multiple-Personality-Disorder. So that's what I'm talking about, disorder. Yeah. But I just don't like the word.
Okay.
I don't like it.
But I get what you mean about my father. I will talk about that later. But to the fact of that it was originally helpful, the way I look at dissociation is like an internal splitting off of parts of yourself, basically to avoid emotions that are too big or too horrific for your psyche to handle. So you just cut them off, you wall them off inside yourself. And the way I give an analogy that it's sort of like an immune system. Like in the beginning, your immune system is good when it fights off microbes. But once it gets too strong, like in an autoimmune disease, it goes crazy, and then it starts mistaking your own body for the microbes and attacking yourself. So the same way, dissociation starts out protective. It's helping you to get through a very horrific situation. But once the situation is past and you no longer need to keep yourself divided, but those divisions don't go away, they just strengthen. The barriers, internal barriers get stronger. It's like an immune system that turned against yourself. It starts being detrimental to yourself. It makes you perceive harmful things in the world as dangerous. You don't have an accurate perception of what's going on because you're still in this fight or flight or protective mode. So, yeah, in that sense, like it starts out being an adaptation and it turns into what's called a disorder. And so the problem with it is not what I just want to backtrack a minute to explain why this usually happens. So dissociative identity disorder is a lot like post-traumatic stress disorder, which means that you're reacting to something that is very difficult for you to handle emotionally. The difference is that with dissociative identity disorder, the trauma usually begins in childhood and it's usually repeated. And it's usually at the hands of someone who the child has to depend on for food and clothing and shelter. So there's no way for this child to escape her environment. So instead of escaping externally, she escapes internally. Like she walls off, I'm just using she, but it could be a he also. She walls off parts of herself so that she's keeping either knowledge of events separate or she's keeping the feelings that went with that separate. Something is separate inside her, and little by little those divisions get more solidified. So that's why it came to be called multiple personality. But dissociative identity is really a better way of saying it. So that's really how it starts. And so when the child is, or whoever, it doesn't have to be a child, but it usually is no longer grows up and then is no longer in that traumatic situation, that child really has no more need to be divided in order to survive, and that's when it turns into a very big problem. And it could be a lifelong problem because you don't always know. It's not always obvious what the problem is. Like you could be always in distress and you don't know why you're always in distress. There's a frozen in time quality to this. So if a 6-year-old part of me was traumatized and split off, when my body is 50 or 60, that internal part is still 6, with all the feelings of that 6-year-old. I mean, I'm 78 years old now, so I'm talking in the 1940s and the 1950s. That part of me is frozen in time in the 1940s and the 1950s and cannot look at the outside world with the correct perception. So that's where the problem comes. But because most people with dissociative identity disorder don't know they have it, and most clinicians don't recognize it, or it's hard to recognize, it's unclear why this person whose life is not really bad right now is always in distress and is always in problem. So that's really when the problem comes. Not when the real problem is externally, but when the real problem no longer is externally.
It's interesting. It's this coping mechanism that your mind and body come up with in order for you to survive. Coping mechanisms, and there's so many different coping mechanisms we use on a daily basis. Maybe not as intense, but we all have coping mechanisms and things we do to get out of uncomfortable situations or move forward on something we really want. We have coping mechanisms. And I mean, this is just one of those.
Exactly. And it's not something the child does consciously. It's sort of, to use the immune analogy again, it's like your immune system kicking in. It just sees that there's a problem. So, and I did a talk a few weeks ago where somebody asked me, somebody said to me in the audience, well, I had a father who was almost like yours, and I had a mother who was almost like yours, and I did not develop dissociative identity disorder. Like, why does this happen to some people and not others? And I really didn't know. So I asked my therapist the next time I saw him, and he said it's really not clear, but 70%, about 70% is the amount of trauma, the intensity of the trauma, and about 30% is just the person. Like some people have a tendency to either go into self-hypnosis without knowing it or go to another space in their head, and some people don't. And that might be something you're born with. But the 70% does make sense to me, and so does this other thing, because I know that there are people who had much worse trauma than I have had, and maybe they didn't develop this. So it's really not clear. It's just what happened to me.
Yeah. Well, and I think that also when you go through a situation, that there's also a blocking off of it. So, I know that, people have been like abused, physically, maybe emotionally too, that or sexually can also block it off. And I also think about, veterans going to war. They go to war, their armed services, and they'll come back and they just kind of do that, block it off. It didn't happen. You don't allow yourself to look at it, and it'll sneak back later. I know that I've been through things in life where, they were scary. And I mean, like, we've been through a lot. We lived in Africa. We've been through, guns at our heads, all kinds of things. And there, in that moment, you handle it, you deal with it. I'm really good at it. And then only later will I figure it out, because I'm one of those who just move forward as a survival thing, and I'm really good at getting groups together to do whatever needs to do in a situation, wildfires, all that, hurricanes, all that. I'll be one of those who get everything done, and then once everything is over, I will freak out then. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like PTSD in a way, but it's this delayed response that I have, and I think that a lot of people have that, where they will shut it off, but it can become dangerous. I think when people go through something traumatic growing up, a lot of times people will end up, some go in the creative side and write. And I want to talk to you about writing and journaling too. I know you talk about that, but it could end up being an addiction of food. It could be exercise. It could be creating a different persona, in that you become like there's a control thing that will happen, so there's all these other things, but I feel like addiction is also a part of that people could end up when they go through something.
It definitely is, and it doesn't have to be either or. You could have more than one of those things going on. A lot of people with dissociative identity disorder also have an eating disorder, and in my case, I also had an attachment disorder. So it doesn't have to be either or.
And that's hard to develop relationships, right? When you have that going on, because is there a point where you go, okay, which is the real person? I mean, as we grow up, the usual trend is, hey, you're finding yourself, coming of age, all of that. it almost sounds very romantic, right? It's that romantic idea of, oh, I'm learning who I am. Let me backpack around Europe and discover myself. That's a little bit different in your shoes, like to find out who you are through all of that.
Well, that's what the treatment which could take years, is all about. And but because dissociative identity disorder is generally adaptive, I did have like a part. I don't call them alter personalities. I call them parts. I did have a part of me that grew up and went to college and got a degree and got a job and was successful, and even had boyfriends, but that was a sliver of me. It wasn't a through and through me. And that was the external part that I let the world see. And it was sometimes I could fool myself into thinking that's all of me there was. And I didn't know why I felt so empty and so unreal. And so like I felt as if I were there was a plexiglass wall that went from the ground to the sky, and I was on one side of it, and all of the rest of humanity was on the other. And I could talk through the wall, but I couldn't ever get to that side. And it's not until I found out that I had at the time it was called multiple personality disorder. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, changed the name in the 1990s, and I found out I had it in the late 1980s. It's not until I realized that all the rest of my life going back began to make sense. Until that time, there were so many. I knew something wasn't right, and I knew that it's not normal to see faces in the mirror and talk to them that are not your own. And I knew a whole lot of things, and since I'm a librarian, I did a lot of research. I read, I tried to find a diagnosis for me, because in the hospital they labeled me as schizophrenic, and I didn't think that was right, but it was the only thing that made sense at the time. But every single thing I read, I could fit that description for an hour or two, but I would switch back and forth. So I read catatonic, I read different things, and I realized I can't be that, because I snap out of it like so quickly. I just change, but whatever the situation needs. And a friend of mine, when I was in college, she once said to me, how could you be so upset one minute and so fine the next? And I said, I don't know, I just snap in another cassette. I mean, I didn't know what I meant at the time. I was just in college. But so the fact that I finally knew that that's what I had put the whole rest of my life in perspective. And while it was a very scary diagnosis at first, because at the time it was called multiple personality disorder, and the only people you heard of who had it were the three faces of Eve and Sybil. And it was not, Yeah. And but at the same time, so much made sense. And then, since I am a librarian, then I went back to the library and started researching it, and I found out that there was a whole lot written about it that it was starting to be written about, and that, it wasn't as rare as it sounded, and that there were clinicians that were experienced in it. And also that there were some clinicians who didn't believe it existed, which is another problem. So, I forgot. I sort of digressed from what you just asked, but I forgot where I was now.
You're allowed to go wherever you want.
What you're saying is, when these life things are happening and everything's so emotional, and sometimes there's physical abuse, sometimes it's emotional. Well, I can't even separate physical from emotional, because if you're physically abused, you are emotionally abused as well. When these things are occurring, I think your body and your mind have an argument, and the survival is going to be what comes forward. So sometimes your body wins, sometimes your mind wins on how you're going to cope with the situation, and then it's only later, when you're not in the drama territory, when you're not threatened, that you can even start to think about what just went on. And it took me years to realize that my father suffered from a whole lot of mental illnesses. If you want to call them mental illnesses, you want to call them personality disorders or whatever, but only the abuser. When a person's that abusive, you got to know they're sick. You know, and you're only really thinking from like your position because you're in danger. But now when you look back, do you see that there's the side where your father, like my father, was ill, and I will include my mother because she did nothing to stop it, and I think that's an illness.
Right, that's a betrayal of you. You know, someone once told me that in a situation where one parent is abusive, it's usually the parent who's not abusive that the child hates more for not doing anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that you said is about the parents being in trouble psychologically is so true. But when you're a child, you don't understand that.
No, you
when
don't.
You're a child, you just think they're doing this because they're doing this to me because something's wrong with me. And if I were better, if I were this good and this and this that, this wouldn't be happening to me. Right. So you don't blame it on the parent. You might hate the parent, but deep down, you really believe that if you were perfect, it wouldn't happen.
Yeah. No, that's true. Except I had a grandmother who would rescue us when things got really bad and made it very clear who the problem was. She was really good about that. Like she just shored us up with it's not you, it's him. It's not you, it's him. It's not you, it's him. Keep it in your mind. You know, and
you were very lucky to have her. Yeah. That was great.
Yeah. It was really lucky with that.
I wanted to talk to you about your mom because you did like kind of have a reconcile point with her. I mean, did she realize what was going on? I mean, where was she in this whole part? Like your dad is, you know, not easy to deal with and not necessarily a nice person as you're growing up, but your mom, where was that? I mean, it to reconcile, did she have to go through her own purging of what happened?
She did it in her own way, and in her later years she was heavy into self-help books. But, you know, the way I understand my mother is that my mother was born in 1914. There was no women's lib in 1914. Right. There was no women's movement. I mean, there were suffragettes, but they didn't. And she was born to immigrant parents. And her parents were Greek Jews who came through Ellis Island in 1903. And my grandmother, they never sent girls to school in her town. So my grandmother did not read or write.
Wow.
All her children, but she was very, very smart, and she also had a very strong sense of family. So she had 8 girls and 1 boy. She kept trying for a boy. That was the thing. The whole thing is girls didn't count. Boys counted. And so my mother, but even though she had 8 girls, 7 of whom grew up to adulthood. So she had 1 boy and 8 and 7 girls. And she instilled in all those girls that the most important thing to do is to get married. That is the most important thing. She didn't mind that they all wanted to get educated. Most of them went to college. My mother was an elementary school principal. But my mother still grew up with her mother thinking in her head that the most important thing is to stay married. And my mother had gone through 1 divorce before I was born. So she was married between 1936 and 1939, and then she got divorced because her husband left her for her best friend. And so when she met my father, she was... You know, I don't think she was in love with my father the way she was with her first husband, but, you know, my father was interesting. He played chess and he liked classical music and he was paying attention to her. And the main thing was she was supposed to be married. So when he proposed after 3 months that they knew each other, she said yes. And she was determined the rest of her marriage, no matter how bad it was, that she was not going to be a single person again. She needed a husband. And so, my mother did try, when she had to go to a nursing home and I was cleaning out her apartment, I found so much. I wouldn't say she kept an official journal, but that's what it really was. She had things that she wrote from the 1940s and the 1950s.
Wow.
And there was one where she was going to some counseling herself, and they said, this is family counseling, and if your husband doesn't come, you can't keep coming here. And she asked my father to go, and he refused to go. And so, my mother knew, but my mother also was erratic herself. I mean, she could be very supportive of me, and then she could turn around and curse me and things like that. And so, but I always considered her the more rational one. I would say that my father loved me unequivocally. His behavior was much more harsh than my mother's, but I never felt the love from her that I felt from him. Every single harsh thing he did to me or my brother was because he thought it was going to help us. He thought he had such a hard time in life because his parents died when he was a teenager, and he had to drop out of school, and he had to support his 3 younger siblings. So when he always thought that if he used to say, if mommy and I die, you need to know how to support yourself. He told me that when I was 8 years old. When I was 8 years old, he started teaching me stenography, and when I was 10, he started teaching 8 and 10. 8 years old was typing, and 10 was stenography. And because he wanted me to be ready for the job world. So that's a benign thing that he did. Other more harsh things, even the punishments, were really because he thought we were going on the wrong track and we wouldn't survive, in the world. And so it was. I wouldn't say that love is an excuse, but I understood that he loved me. I never felt that love from my mother, except in her later years when we had a reconciliation. But she was always the more, quote, normal, unquote, sounding person. When my father wouldn't let me watch a TV program on Abraham Lincoln that the teacher assigned the class to watch.
Oh, gosh.
My aunt said, okay, because we didn't have a TV. My father didn't approve of them. My aunt said, well, you couldn't watch it in my apartment. My father would not let me go into my aunt to watch the TV program because he felt that the teacher has no right to tell you what to do at home. The teacher only has a right to tell you what to do in school. And so my mother had to write a note. My mother could not convince him to let me watch the TV program. So she asked me if I wanted her to write a note to my teacher explaining why I didn't do the homework, the essay. And I was really embarrassed, but I told her to write it. So, my father didn't do these things because he hated me. He did it because he just thought it was right. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like your dad, Nancy, your father.
It's
that kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard.
And it's
I
like
think
they were born in a different century or something. Everything around you is moving at a fast pace, and then you've got this parent who's stuck in God knows what century that just can't move on, or and
Vivian made a good point. This was, you got to think about 1914. I look at my Nana, my great grandma was born 1900, and we're in 2020 going to 2021. So this is like 100 years of history and change, and so much was going on before that. Before you think about look at the grandparent nucleus and immigrants coming over to this country at that time. They went through hardship, and this was like the promised land, but they knew they had to work their butts off to make things happen. And so there was this old world lifestyle, old world culture coming to a new land, and everybody was shaping this right and wrong. Whether now we can go, oh, well, that's terrible, but that's how it was back then. And changes have been made slowly but surely. Like the fact that you had, books as your resource, being a librarian, that is amazing. And some people don't have that, even now. Some libraries need help. They have books that, the latest books was from the 1940s, depending on what state you're in now. The internet has really helped though on the flip side. So there are tools, I think, and the fact that you sunk into those resources available to you really helped it for you to know, okay, go get help. But what I wonder about is when someone may be going through this process today, when they need to know, okay, I do need to go and seek help, and who should I seek help? Because we're in a world where, even now, like if you break your arm, you have to think twice about going to the ER. You know what I mean? It's like you don't know if they have a bed or, a surgeon for you and you want to get COVID. We're in this really weird world with that, on top of people not being able to afford health care. Our country is in a healthcare crisis. So when it comes to mental health, I think that kind of gets cut away on people. It's like, oh, I'm going to go search for a therapist. And it's almost, I don't know, I think for a lot of people, it's some people are all about therapy. It's like they go to therapy all the time. It's something that's part of their lifestyle, just, no matter what's happened in their life. But for some people, it's like almost shameful, you know what I mean? Like it's embarrassing, let's put it that way, shy to go to get help for mental health.
Right, and the problem also with dissociative identity disorder is it's not obvious right away what's the matter. So someone could say, well, why don't you just snap out of it? Nothing bad is happening to you now, and so and a lot of therapists don't know what to look for. But if someone is in this situation and doesn't know, if they look for, because you can look online and see what the therapist specializes in. Their Psychology Today has a website that lists therapists with what their specialties are. And someone who is specializes in trauma, or if they say they won't, the person who's looking for therapy might not necessarily know they have dissociative disorder, but they might know that they were, that they have had trauma, and so it's really important to have the right therapist. And if you go to a therapist after a few times and you don't feel a click, you don't feel something, just don't stay. I stayed too long with several. If you read my book, you see I stayed too long with some therapists who may have been well-meaning, but they really didn't know, and they were not helpful, and one was even harmful. So I think it's really important. If you do know that you have dissociative identity disorder and you're looking for a therapist, the ISSTD, which is the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, it's an organization for clinicians. They have a website, and on part of their website is for clients who may be looking for a therapist, and you could look in your area, your geographic area, and you could see who specializes in this. And they also have a lot of information on it for the layperson, even though it's for the main organization is for clinicians. The layperson could get a lot of information about the diagnosis and about what the treatment is, and about just a whole lot of resources. So it's the ISSTD.org.
Thank you for sharing that. I know on your website, everyone, if you go to Vivian-Conan.com, that you'll be able to see she has a site, a page of resources as well for you to tap into. When in regards to writing the memoir, I know journaling, that's part of therapy, but then actually writing, and I know you've written articles and columns in various publications and sites, but writing this, this has got to have been a process because I was looking at like you're going back in from like when you were a little girl to now. I mean, you're spanning some time in this, and that's got to be kind of. Was it kind of like rehashing it? Did it feel therapeutic like journaling or different?
It's very different from journaling because in journaling you're not censoring yourself. You're spilling everything out, and you're spilling out raw guts and raw emotion, and that's what you should do when you journal. But you can't dump that on a reader without any organization, or the reader will just not read your book. So, but what happens, because people have asked me that too. They've said, first of all, how did you remember all of these details? Oh. And second of all, was it painful to write? And the answer basically is that dissociation helped me with both of those. It sounds funny because dissociation is ostensibly the disorder I was writing about. But because dissociation has this frozen in time quality, so if I'm writing about a part of me that came into existence in the 1950s or when I was 6, that part is frozen in time with all the feelings and the memories of as if it's happening now. And yet there's another quality of dissociation, which the internal divisions and the barriers that separate them, the internal barriers, they're not 100% impermeable. There are sometimes leaks that information could go either in one direction or both. And so because of that, there was another part of me who could write, that could be aware of what this 6-year-old part was feeling, but this writer part of me didn't have to necessarily feel it, but could translate it onto the page. So it's really not like journaling, because I had to shape the story. Like when you journal, you don't say this happened first and this happened second and make the story have an arc that someone could follow. When you're journaling, you just spill it out. But I had to. It is true though that if different internal parts of me were having a hard time on different days related to what happened in the past, I used that. I would write about that part that day, even if that's not where it was going to come in the book. Like I tell my book chronologically when you read it, but I didn't write it chronologically. I wrote whatever was pushing up from me, inside me, on the day that I was writing. I wrote that, and when I was all done, I took the pieces and put them in chronological order.
That makes
Yeah,
that total sense, And I think sometimes it could be quite innocent, but you could be shopping, you could be at a restaurant, you can be watching a few people talk next to you or something, but a person's dress, a color, or something they've done, a mannerism they may have that triggers your own memory, that really they're not related at all, other than it triggers something. And all of a sudden, something you thought you wouldn't remember or you didn't want to remember comes to the forefront, and it's going to be something so minor that triggers it, like even just the color of a pantsuit. Or
exactly. And so when that happens, you're lucky if you realize that this is from a long time ago and don't react. Like keep it inside until you could get home and then spill it out or whatever you want to do. If you're not lucky and you're not able to put that filter on, say, look, this is now time. It's not before time, And so I have said inappropriate things to people, or I have reacted as if someone was attacking me when in reality they were not attacking me at all, and if I knew the person later, I could apologize. Sometimes it was to strangers, but it is true that does happen, and that's why those internal divisions have become a liability. They're not adaptive anymore.
Right.
I think that's a nature thing. It's a protective thing. Like animals will run when they don't really have to, but their senses tell them you need to run.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they run, and then they turn around, look, and then they run, and they turn around, look, and like, well, why am I running? If you know, because your senses said get the heck out, and your senses don't always make sense, but your body is instructed to react to threat.
Yeah, it's sort of like instinct, even though it's not instinct, it's like instinct.
Yeah. You know what I find, kind of on the scientific interesting side of this is, going into different identities. I wonder about actors going into these different roles. I mean, to me, it's interesting because then you get to step in other people's shoes, and it's like, and I think nature has always used mimicry in some way. I mean, you look at the mockingbird, one of my favorite birds will not mock, but copy. That's why it's called a mockingbird. Copy sounds around it. And you can still tell it's a mockingbird, but it has all the sounds. And it will copy a crow. It'll copy sounds of a phone. It'll copy whatever's going on in its neighborhood to fit in a way. And it uses it as a tactic, And so I wonder about this, too, with animals, because animals kind of have these different personalities of doing things and swapping roles in camouflage. And then you look at humans, and culturally, over the years, humans look to nature and embody what nature is doing to get through something. So you got to look at the cultures that, kill animals like rhinos for rhino horns sexually so that they could be like a rhino in bed or whatever. There's all kinds of things that we have done, even culturally with different deities and gods. They look at a certain animal or a tree or whatever and want to embody that spirit of that to become that, and have almost created certain things as gods just to try to embody it and use that for whatever they're weak in to boost their strength. And I mean, there's so many examples of it. That's kind of like, as we were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, we've been doing this culturally for years. And animals have been doing it in so many ways, using other animals. Like there are birds and there are butterflies and things that will have eyes on the back of them that you'll think this is, a bird, but it's not. It's a butterfly. Whatever. There's all these tactics that they have of embodying something else, all out of survival in some way or pleasure. So I wonder about that connection down the road, if it will all link up in some way. Or I could be completely wrong, but I kind of feel like it's connected in some way. Because mimicry is part of having those extra personalities too, right? Because those personalities have got to come from somewhere. So it's kind of interesting in that way.
I never thought of that. It's very interesting what you said, and the
I'm
more
weird.
the more you were saying it. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know that the animal is doing that. I guess they're doing it for survival, and it's not an accident in the parts or personalities or alter personalities. They're not random how they are, that they come into being. They, each person who has dissociative identity disorder has their own internal system of personalities, but there are general types of personalities. There are protectors, there are memory holders, there are littles, like little children. There are, and then there are self-helpers or internal soothers, and it's usually even though they have those general types, the way it manifests in each specific person is really because of something in that person's life. It's not a random thing that, I just became this other person, random, that has nothing to do with anything in my life.
No. Because
we react to what's happening to us, and depending on the strength of what's happening to us, there goes the reaction to it. So if you have minor incidences in your life, you react in a minor way. And if I think it's more on the repetitive. Like one bad thing can happen and you can move past it. But when it's repetitive for a number of years, it's way harder to move past it, and your mind and your body builds up something to help you survive. And when drama's going down, first thing is the reaction. It's not like you really get to think it over. Your body reacts before you really can say, oh, what's the wisest thing for me to do at this point? That hardly happens when there's an emotional trauma happening to you, or somebody's, coming at you. You don't like, oh, let me think about this. You just kind of, your body takes over and you react, and it's not always the right thing, but it's what your body says it's going to do. Yeah.
Right. It's sort of like when someone is chasing you, your adrenaline kicks in and you run. You don't say, "Oh, adrenaline, I need you. Come squirt, give me a squirt."
Right.
It just happens. It just happens. I do want to say about what you said about it being repetitive. That is very true. So the trauma that causes dissociative identity disorder is usually repeated and it usually occurs in childhood, and it's repeated, and it's by someone who the child depends on for their life. And it could be physical, sexual, emotional, relational. There's something now called relational trauma. In my case, it wasn't so much the harshness of my father's physical punishments as it was like attachment trauma. And it was sort of my mother and my father. And so, sometimes I would read, when I was reading a lot about dissociative disorders, and I would say to myself, well, some of the things that the people went through are much more horrific than anything I went through. But at the bottom line is, it's the way you react to it, and you can't measure people's trauma. You just know that you dissociated from your trauma and they dissociated from their trauma. But it doesn't have to be sexual trauma or it's most often it is sexual abuse, but it doesn't have to be. You can have dissociative identity disorder from any kind of trauma.
Yeah, it's everybody's got their own personal way of dealing with things, and it's not like you sit down and really, you might sit down and go, okay, I'm going to handle it this way, but I don't think that's what comes to the fore. I think it's a combination of your body instincts and your emotions that is beyond what you can control by thinking about it.
Right.
I don't know how else to explain it, but you may think you're going to handle it this way, but that rarely is what happens. And even if you do handle it mentally the way you plan to handle it, the emotional trauma still comes back.
Because you've dissociated it, and the reason the right treatment works is that you need to be in a safe relationship, like say you feel safe with your therapist, and you need to feel the feelings that you have cut off from a long time ago, but now you're feeling them in a context of safety. So you're associating them now not with danger, but with someone. They call it empathic attunement, like somebody who understands it. They're not going to make it better. They're not going to take it away, but they're going to understand how you feel, and it's really, really important for someone to understand your feelings and to make a safe place for you to feel them. And once that happens, with each of the different traumas that you have, or each of the different whatever your internal is, one by one, they no longer have such a hold on you. It doesn't mean you forgot them. It just means that they're not the master of you anymore. Right. You're in control.
Yeah, you're giving the back seat, but you have to face it. You have to face it. You have to face your the drama to be able to get through it. And you have to have a safe place for that. And I I think that's really true. I mean, finding the right therapist is hard, and I'm so glad you have the resources on your website. Real quick before we go, because we're going to play music. It's really good, a good song. I know you sing as well in the Piece of Heart Choir, and then you also mentor teenage writers with Girls Write Now as a volunteer. So it seems that you also, you go through all of this. It does going into the arts like music and writing and connecting with girls and getting them in, to be able to write and working with them. Does that create kind of a solace place, like a freedom in a way? I think singing is a freedom, even though you have to, you have rules, scales you have to follow and timing and the right words and all of that. But there's a freedom in that too. So do you feel that when you're working with the girls and then also singing?
I feel, yes, definitely. Singing is sort of like the conductor gives me permission to make a big sound, like I have to make the right sound, but it feels really liberating. I love that. And working with the girls, because I was in hospitals and I, had lived most of my life half just being mentally ill, I never got married and I never had kids, and I love working with these girls because they're not my kids, but like I pretend, I sort of like I'm a surrogate to them. I'm their mentor, and I also have 3 wonderful nephews and a grandnephew and a grandniece. So yes, I really like that. I'm at a stage in my life where I am, but I have the resources that I have, which are different than I would have expected, but I'm good.
Right on.
Cool.
Well, we like that. We like to hear that. Thank you again for writing your memoir and all the writings that you've been doing, too. Again, everyone, it's called Losing the Atmosphere, a memoir, a baffling disorder, a search for help, and the therapist who understood. You can get it right now. It's out there also an audiobook. I know a lot of us like to listen more than read sometimes, especially if we're traveling. If you go right to Vivian's website, that's the best place. It's Vivian-Conan.com. And we're going to play a song. Today's the day of Borgo music, Nancy. We've been doing a lot of interview recordings, and Vivian's one of them. And Borgo does this song is the title track to his album. And Brian Borgo is his name, is also going through a lot of medical issues, and where basically his muscles are deteriorating on him. And he is pushing through and creating music and is not stopping. So I encourage you to go to his website, borgoband.com. He really is a phenomenal talent. He is a wonderful human being. He's been on our show a few times, and he's not letting any kind of disability stop him in creating. He's doing it. I'm in awe of what he's done. I know. And I just thought this was an appropriate song. It's called Be Kind. It's the title track to his album, Be Kind, obviously. And it reminds us to be kind to ourselves. So it's a beautiful song. So I wanted to play it especially for you, Vivian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You take care. Here it is, everyone. Be kind.
Be strong for yourself and everyone else. Be strong. Other and be kind. Be kind. Come on. Yeah, come on. Reach out your head and hold the hand that's reaching out. You know what I'm talking about. find a way.